Do you think sales is a bad word? When you hear the word sales, I wonder what images come to mind. Whatever your relationship is with selling, I'm glad you're here. Let's have a conversation about how to sell like a good human. Hi, welcome to Conversations with Good Humans. I'm your host, Catherine Brown, and I'm author of the book called How Good Humans Sell. Today on Conversations with Good Humans, I'm talking with Drew Bird, emotional intelligence trainer, expert, and the author of the great book that I've read twice called The Leader's Guide to Emotional Intelligence. His organization, called the EQ Development Group, trains leaders and their teams to improve their efficiency and effectiveness through improved emotional intelligence. Drew has done some training for my weekly sales coaching group, and he and I have also had the pleasure of meeting in person a few times. Recording this interview with Drew was a lot of fun because both of us really like to geek out talking about the implications of emotional intelligence. I think you'll enjoy hearing us and our banter with that. Additionally, I hope that it's encouraging as you hear that our EQ, for all of us, it isn't something that is fixed. Each of us can grow in the areas that we need to relate to humans the way that we want. Thank goodness for that growth. If you like this episode, please leave me a review. It will help me know what topics I should include in the future, and it helps people find the podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Drew, thanks so much for joining me. I have invited you recently to come and speak with my clients to offer insight about this subject that you know a lot about, which is emotional intelligence. It really helped me when you spoke to the group to talk about what is emotional intelligence, what are the letters EQ, what are some basic terms. So before we get too far along and listeners think, oh, I know what they're going to say, I thought your definitions were really helpful. So let's start with that as a baseline and define some terms and then go from there.
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you again. So first thing, we tend to use two terms fairly interchangeably, EQ and EI. And if we follow the rules, EI stands for emotional intelligence, and EQ stands for emotional quotient. So essentially, the simplest way is EI is what it is, EQ is how much of it you have. That's sort of the simplest paradigm to come up with.
That's great.
And that's useful as a sort of a dictionary definition. But of course, it's so complex and there's so much underneath that a lot of people will say that they have heard of EQ or heard of EI. And there's just so much sort of below that, so much that goes under the surface.
When I hear the term emotional intelligence, I think it's about how much I recognize is going on in myself with my own emotions, my ability to communicate effectively, not in a manipulative way, right? But effectively communicate what it is that I'm feeling. So I have to identify what I'm feeling, I have to communicate what I'm feeling, and then my ability also to understand another person who presumably is doing the same thing, understanding what's happening and then communicating it. Is that right? Is there more? How else would you define that?
Yeah, I think that is right. I mean, there's this interesting aspect of emotional intelligence, which is the relationship with yourself. And that relationship with yourself, the voice inside your head that talks to you constantly, from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night, that conversation is fundamental. That relationship is fundamental to our daily lived experience. And a big part of emotional intelligence is the sense that we make of that conversation. So if the voice inside my head is a ongoing negative troublemaker that's constantly telling me how bad things are going and how ineffective I am, that's going to affect the way I feel. And lots of people do struggle with negative self-talk. It's not an uncommon thing whatsoever. So the first sort of aspect of emotional intelligence is understanding a little bit about that voice inside your head and the relationship that you have with it. Seth Godin, the author, has a great question, which is, if the voice inside your head was a real person, would you choose to hang out with them? I think it's great because when I was younger, certainly probably into my, I'm going to say 40s, probably not would be my answer. That person was kind of negative. They were a little bit unproductive, accusatory. And now whether it's a result of doing this kind of work or whether it's just a result of getting older, But I find that the voice in my head now is actually kind of okay. Still has its moments. There are still times when I don't find it super productive, but managing that relationship with the voice in your head is a really important part. Then we have the interpersonal or the social aspect of emotional intelligence, which is that you interact with people constantly and you take information from the interactions, you process that information, you make choices about what you're going to do with that information, and then you act on that information as well. Every interaction we have has an emotional intelligence component sort of running through it. A common example I give is, you go to the grocery store, you're at the checkout, you pick up a pack of gum, you put it on the counter, you make eye contact with the person behind the counter. You ask yourself, are they smiling? Are they not smiling? Do they look happy? Do they look unhappy? If they've got a big grin, then maybe you say, oh, hey, how's it going? And you have a conversation with them. Maybe you avoid eye contact. And we all know that as we go through life, sometimes we feel in a positive frame of mind, and we will deliberately engage even strangers in a dialogue. We also know that if we're having a negative frame of mind, or a good day or a bad day, if you want to call it that, you're not as engaging. You don't want to talk to strangers. You don't want to have a conversation with a checkout person. And all of this is a product of and a reflection of our emotional intelligence.
It seems like people are more familiar with the term emotional intelligence, but even though the letters EQ stand for emotional quotient, nobody says emotional quotient. Probably except EQ trainers, I'm guessing, right? And so I think that's a funny thing. But the word quotient is helpful because it tells me that something can be measured, which leads me to my question is, can it change? And you gave an example of your own life as you've gotten older because you've worked and practiced on it. All these different reasons you feel like that voice inside your head and then what you do with it has evolved. It has changed. But I think this is worth mentioning because those of us that, let's just say it this way, I have purposely chosen to never find out my IQ. I literally don't know my IQ.
Okay.
Because I don't want to know. Because I can't see any good coming from it. I feel like I'm either going to find that it's higher than I thought, and I'm going to think, what have I done with my life? Or it's lower than I thought, and I'm going to say, see, I knew it. But what's interesting is I'm crazy about EQ because I know the research shows that your emotional quotient can change considerably with practice, whereas IQ is much more fixed and difficult to move. I'm not saying it doesn't change at all, but it changes less, right?
That is what the science says, yes. Debate's still out about whether your IQ can be increased or whether you're maximizing your IQ within a certain boundary. A good example here is I use is playing a musical instrument. So, I have a guitar in the living room, looks great. I don't, people say, do you play the guitar? I have a guitar. I don't play it very much. If I pick that guitar up every day and I play it for a few minutes for a couple of years, I'll probably get reasonably good. I'll be, not bad at playing a guitar, but I'm never going to be a concert guitarist. My capacity to be incredibly good at playing the guitar is limited by what I'm capable of. Similarly with IQ and similarly with EQ, there's a limit to what we're capable of. If you do math every day, this is what these brain training games on our phones do. If you do math every day, you are going to get better at math over time, just as a process of practice and awareness. Are you ever going to be a genius mathematician? No matter how much you practice, how much you use the skill, there's probably a limit of what you're capable of. And so, the phrase living into your potential, I think, can apply to IQ and EQ. And although I don't study IQ and I'm sort of basically familiar with it, I've seen people live into possibilities around EQ that surprise them themselves.
That's amazing. Now, I know because we share some mutual friends that there are resources that actually measure emotional intelligence. And this can be used, I assume, in a variety of settings, but the one I know the most is in the world of executive coaching. Will you talk a little bit about how these things are measured and just a little bit? I know we could go really deep on this with the subscales and things like that, but what is measured? And how would a listener decide if they wanted to be measured about that?
Yeah, there are sort of three basic kinds of assessment. There's what we call trait-based assessments. They measure your tendency to do certain things around emotional intelligence. So, for example, how often do you back down even when you know you're right? Or how often do you make decisions without other people's input? So we can measure traits of emotional intelligence. We can also measure ability of emotional intelligence. How good are you at recognizing somebody's facial expression? How good are you at determining the best course of action in a complex interpersonal scenario? And then the third type is assessments that mix both of those. They have some ability-based measure, some trait-based measure. The one that I use most in my work is a trait-based measure called the EQI. And it's a psychometric assessment, scientifically validated, that you can take to get a baseline of your emotional intelligence.
What kind of things, Drew, does it measure?
Well, so for example, it measures, to what degree are you aware of the areas in which you need to grow? Are you willing to change your mind easily? Do you tend to avoid problems rather than deal with them? Do you take an interest in others and other people's emotional states? Do you understand what happens to you when you get in difficult, challenging, and stressful situations? That kind of thing is all measured through a trait-based measure. We do have to be careful, though, because the assessments I'm talking about are self-assessments.
Right.
And that means that really what you're doing is you're reflecting on your own opinion of your emotional intelligence. And so sometimes I'll work with people, they'll look at their assessment results and they'll look at them and think, wow, I'm so emotionally intelligent. and you sort of have to add to the end of that in your own opinion.
Right. I joke on the podcast with some other episodes. I've joked about my in-house counsel. I think my listeners know I have lived with a researcher and psychologist, and I've specifically heard him talk about, especially the component of the EQI that is reality testing. He's like, oh, some people don't know what their reality really is, and they're deluded. Yeah. So how are they going to score well on that? So it is useful, but not perfect.
It is. And I always remind myself that we're at the beginning of this journey around understanding this thing called emotional intelligence. The research has been going on since the formal research. But we've always tried to understand ourselves. That's ancient philosophy. But, the research around emotional intelligence specifically has been around since the 80s. So it's relatively new. And we are still trying to get our arms around this pretty vague, nebulous topic and interpret it in certain ways. And lots of research still ongoing about it. A lot of the research nowadays is around application. So how do we apply emotional intelligence? Much less research now going on around what it is, which in a way I think is a shame, because I think, although we have some really good models to work from, some really good bases to work from, there's still quite a lot of work to do.
Yes, I'm going to use that to piggyback to my next question to make this point, because you and I have talked offline about how I love this expression that you used when you were teaching my clients, and you use the phrase emotional courage. And what I think is interesting, so see if my train of thought makes sense here. What I like about it is that when I hear the term emotional courage, I think, can I manage myself to do whatever is the thing that felt risky? And this is a business development podcast. We talk about a lot of things about human potential and the intersection of personal development and sales. But ultimately, people mostly listen, because they want to get better at selling. What I thought was so interesting in the example that you gave to clients, which I'd like to ask you to repeat here, is people were giving live examples of challenges they were having. When I hear just the broad term emotional intelligence, I think of things like ability to read their face, ability to get the cues, ability to know, to guess accurately or semi-accurately what my prospect might be feeling. But then we talked in the training about how it's actually the validating of that, the asking, why is the room so quiet? Why did no one jump on that example I just gave? What might they be thinking? It's actually asking people and testing your assumption that requires emotional courage. That's something I took away from that. So I think it's interesting because I want people to have hope when they're listening, because even if you say you take the EQI and you don't score particularly well in whatever it says about your ability to make those inferences, you can practice the way you ask and demonstrate emotional courage. That's what I took from our former conversation. Would you like to build on that?
Yeah, so there are a certain number of sort of general emotional intelligence principles that are separate from any model or construct, and they're just useful ways to look at how we go through life. And one of those is emotional courage. So emotional courage is the willingness or ability to do things that make you uncomfortable. And so that could be, it could be speaking up in a large group and saying, hey, listen, I have a different perspective, or I'm sorry, but that joke is really not appropriate, or something like that. In a sales context, it's emotional courage is picking up the phone, knowing that the person on the other end might be, at worst offensive and maybe at best rude, or dismissive, and then picking up the phone again and picking up the phone again and again. Like, this is an act of courage. Now, if you're a seasoned cold caller, you might think, well, it's just easy, just pick the phone up. Like, what does it matter? That's because emotional courage is one of those aspects that can be really built over time. I do a lot of public speaking. When I first started sort of public speaking or training back in the mid 90s, I used to get really nervous, and the nervousness dissipates really fast when you do it 3, 4, 5 days a week, as I was doing back then. Now, if I'm standing in a room of 40, 50 people, I don't get nerves anymore, not really. There might be some, a bit sort of anticipatory butterflies, but that's about it. But it's weird. If you put me in a room with 400 or 500 people, I still get quite nervous. And, I do have that sort of momentary feeling where I think, I should just leave. I should just go. If I just walked away, they'd never find me. So emotional courage is a skill that can be built, whether it's public speaking, whether it's cold calling. It is really just overcoming your own fears. And that can be on a micro level, picking up the phone, or it could also be on a macro level. One of my favorite quotes by a lady called Susan Kassem, I think that's the right pronunciation, is, fear has killed more dreams than failure ever will. I absolutely love that quote. Fear has killed more dreams than failure ever will. And we can talk ourselves out of almost anything. And emotional courage is the ability to say, no, I'm not going to back away from this. I'm going to sort of push forward and do something that's difficult. And I know for myself, and I'm sure other people have experienced this as well, when you really stand up for yourself, whether it's in a sales scenario, whether it's in a marketing scenario, whether it's an interpersonal scenario, you grow exponentially in that moment. You know you can do it. You know that this is something you can do. Emotional courage is walking away from a sale that you don't think is right for the client. Emotional courage is telling the client that you really think this is the right solution for them, because you truly believe it is. And I follow the principles in How Could Humans Sell. So if I'm advocating for a product with a client, then I believe it's the right solution for the client.
Right.
So I do view sales particularly as a process that requires emotional courage. And people that say, I don't agree, I don't think it requires any emotional courage, are probably seasoned salespeople, because they've built that emotional courage over time. And of course, it's very easy to forget what you felt earlier on. Just like when I was working with some group last week that was going to make some presentations at a conference, and one of them said that they were really nervous, and it would have been easy for me to turn around and say, don't worry about it. It's easy, because once you've done it, it is.
Right. Part of why, building on this idea of being nervous, whether it's to pick up the phone or give the presentation that has all the stakeholders in the conference room, or be at a conference of 500 people, whatever the thing is, part of why you're nervous, though, goes back to our earlier conversation about the voice in your head, because that voice is telling you what you believe is true.
Yeah.
And so part of why I'm so bullish about talking about beliefs in selling is that there's so much power in learning to slow things down and notice that, because you can reframe what you believe, and you can grow and change what you believe. And those beliefs are informing what you're saying is true with a capital T, when really it's a little case T in lots of cases. I'm in this moment believing this is a threat to me, but really this isn't a threat to me. I gave the example to a client recently. I was trying to remember, I've been selling for a couple decades, so I'm sure that there are examples I don't remember perfectly, but I was trying to remember how many people in my whole career, when I ran a cold calling company and when I was an employee of 2 other firms before I started my first business.
Yeah.
Trying to remember how many people had been outright mean to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty certain it was fewer than 10 ever.
Yeah.
And I mean, think of the hours. Like, this isn't the 10,000 hour rule. This is like the 100,000 hour rule. I mean, probably 10 people. And I'm actually rounding up to say 10. I'm being generous because I do think I've seared in my brain. I can specifically remember the study that I was working in and the house I lived in at the time where one of them happened, because he really was pretty mean, and that was jarring, and it made an impression in my brain. But even now, it's so interesting, Drew, because I look back at those situations and I really have been able to reframe it to not make them wrong or make them bad, because I think, I don't know what was going on in that person's life at that moment. So even when I choose to believe about them, when the call doesn't go the way that I want, that's my choice. So I think part of why it imprinted and created some scared response in me, that I began to be afraid that would happen again, even though statistically it was very improbable. Even my very way I defined why he was mean to me or chose to remember the way it happened informed how I then felt when I had a similar physiological feeling, an emotion later. That was still a choice, in my opinion. That was a choice. And I made a choice to remember that and rehearse that in a very unhelpful way, which, even though statistically didn't happen very often, I still really built that up to be something worse than it probably was.
Yeah, and we do we do learn from our experiences in those situations. So if you can have a bad call and the person's mean or even disrespectful or rude, whatever you want to call it, and to be able to say to yourself, that probably has more to do with the day that they are having than it does with my approach. Somebody once said to me, what's your biggest fear about phoning somebody up? And my fear is, I said to them, well, my fear is that they're going to think that I'm wasting their time, or they're not going to like me, or they're going to think I'm a bad person. And I was like, and they were like, is that a realistic fear? And I'm not sure, because I don't know them. And they're like, so you would literally believe that you can imagine how another person feels, which is really, think about that for a second. That is such a weird thing to, like, who do you think you are that you can imagine how another person feels that you've never talked to or have ever met? Like, so it's, as soon as it's a lot of the work around emotional intelligence is really starting to recognize and manage that voice inside your head. I had an experience last weekend. I went to a store to pick up something which I pre-ordered. It was not there, and the person said, well, let me get the manager. The manager came out, and you could tell just by looking at their body language, they were ready for a big argument with me about how angry I was going to be and everything else. And they said, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. The product's not here. And I said, you know what, that's totally fine. I get that it's a system, it's a process. And, she said, is there anything I can do for you right now to make this better? I said, no, I really appreciate your time. Have a great day. And, I sort of walked out of the store. To do that required that I was having a conversation in my head about the fact that this manager had no control over the inventory system for this nationwide organization. And if she didn't have the product, she didn't have the product. I could get angry about the fact I'd driven 45 minutes to get there and now I'm going to drive 45 minutes home. And so instead, I walked outside and my wife's standing there and she's like, did you get it? I was like,
where is it?
They didn't have it. And she's like, oh, that sucks. I said, yeah, it's a beautiful day for a drive though. And we just got in the car and drove home. And so, and that's the other thing is that, it's like if you have a really bad call, you can let that really bad call spoil the next 15 minutes or half an hour or the rest of your day so you don't pick up the phone again. Or you can just shrug it off and move on because there's nothing you can do about it now. It's not like you could phone them back and say, hey, listen, sorry that call went so badly. Let me take another 5 minutes of your time while I apologize for how bad the call went. Like it's done. Like that's gone. That opportunity has passed.
But let me ask you, because I do think there's a third way. Like you're saying, you can choose to rehearse it where that it didn't go well, you can shrug it off. But like something that I talk about, in my teaching is that we're all interpreting all the time anyway. So why not
Mhm.
interpret in a way that helps you like the person more, feel calmer, feel more empathetic, whatever it is. And I have a funny quick example because it's a teenager story. I think that road rage is so scary
Mhm.
because I have always lived in states where people have conceal and carry, and there really literally are guns on the road, and people are
Yeah.
hotheads. And I live now in Houston, Texas, and there's a lot of traffic. You can tell even on my walk, I have to cross a major street in the morning. I can see that we're recording this in the fall and school's about to start. And so I can see the traffic uptick. And so it's
Mhm.
just really,
Mhm.
really busy where I live. I am always trying to keep myself calm when I get cut off, because you get cut off a lot when you drive in
Yep.
Houston as in other major cities. And I don't know where I got the idea. I literally can't remember, Drew, but years ago, I started coaching myself and saying that person might be on the way to the hospital. They're having a medical emergency. Because that was better to me to tell myself that might be what's happening than to say they're a jerk or become angry, because I'm trying to keep myself down because I'm anti road rage, right? So I told my kids this. I teach my kids to drive, and I said, probably they're not being thoughtful, but it's not helpful to you to rehearse that because it gets you elevated, and then you also become more defensive as opposed to proactive, an offensive driver, and there's this whole chain of reaction that happens. So I said, you want to stay calm by feeling filled with empathy, and remember that they might be really in a rush because they're having a personal emergency, medical emergency, something like that. And I was reminding one of my kids one day, and they said, Mom, no one has that many medical emergencies. But even though
Yeah.
it's funny and I'm laughing about it, I'm not going to change it because it serves me, which is to get me through traffic happy, calm, and not hating on other people, because I don't like when I do that. So I think we could even make up things. And I wonder where you think that falls under EQ, or what you'd say about that, because I think that meaning making is so powerful and we could use it even more to our advantage.
Yeah. So just to echo your point, I was in Austin, Houston last week, and there was a lot of medical emergencies that day. It's amazing how many there were. Crazy. Um, so what you're reflecting on there is something that we call emotional regulation. So emotional regulation is the ability to manage, police our emotional reactions to things. And in situations like the one that I gave, the customer service situation, you often get time to think about that. So when the person said, I'm going to go get the manager, in the 60 seconds or whatever it was that it took, I got time. I had time to think about it. You may have heard the phrase, life is lived in the gap between
Yeah.
stimulus and response. So between a stimulus and a response, whether it's 1 second, 10 seconds, 10 months, 10 years, there's a gap between the stimulus and then your response. You have a choice in that gap about what to do with that information. In a situation where you get 60 seconds to think about it, you get time from an emotional intelligence perspective to process it through. Okay, this person's probably going to expect to be really angry. I know there's nothing they can do about it. So what's the point of getting really angry? Might as well just move on with their day. But that's different from when somebody cuts you off, when you've got, your teenager in the car, puts you in a seriously dangerous situation. And instead of a stimulus and response, you get stimulus and react. And the gap between stimulus and react is very small.
Yeah.
And I originally grew up in the UK, so the traffic is as bad as you may have seen it, and so there is a lot of finger pointing and gesturing, and fortunately nobody's got guns in their cars in the UK, but it's a different. Certainly if you get cut off, you wave at the person and everything else. And I don't know what it is about road rage, because it's just people, the level of anger. There's been books written on it. The level of anger it gets promoted by or prompted by road rage is significant. But it's a really good way of thinking about it is emotional intelligence, or good emotional intelligence is around slowing down your thinking sufficiently to make proper sense of a situation and choose an
Yes.
appropriate reaction, which
Yes.
is easy when you get the time to do it.
Yes.
If you have trained yourself to have the presence in the moment to say, this is the sense I'm going to attribute to the situation because it's going to stop me doing something like honking the horn or something I shouldn't, then I agree with you that you should just retain that process.
Okay. And can we say, I know they don't perfectly know what's going on in the life of everyone who cuts us off, because that would be presumptive, which we just said a few minutes ago, we don't really want to do. But I mean, I do have a theory. Like, is some of that, though, back to the EQI, I'm familiar with some of the things that are measured in that, is some of what's happening that if a person has a very adverse reaction, they're that out of fear, if fear goes to anger right away, that has something to do with their stress management. It has something to do with their with not just emotional regulation, but actually something else that's going on in there, which is what comes out and how quickly does something come out when I'm under duress. That's a whole other thing that can actually be measured, right?
So, yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult. So a reflection about stress tolerance, but of course, most people feel like they have a decent amount of stress tolerance. And again, in self-report assessments, we have to be careful. You know, if you said to me, do I have a good level of stress tolerance? I'd say, yeah, sure I do. But put me in a situation where my physical safety is threatened or the physical safety of a loved one, very different situation, very different reaction. One interesting thing about the road rage to think about is what's the emotional state or the emotional intelligence of the person cutting me off? Like, are they doing it deliberately? When I was in Austin, there was this, we were sort of, merging lanes, and there was this person that would not let me in. Like, it was, if you do the zipper merge as you're supposed to, it was my turn to come in, and they were just, they just weren't going to let me in. And I'm sitting there thinking, what is going through this person's mind? Like, this piece of tarmac is so precious to them that they're not going to let me in. And so I like you, I'm like, so maybe they don't understand the zipper roll. Maybe they don't understand how that works. In every sort of social interaction, there's the other person and there's you. And so it's as useful to think about, you don't know and you can never know, but it's as useful to think about what the other person's state of mind might be as it is to monitor and manage your own reaction to it as well.
Yes. But if you're a person, Drew, you've heard me use this expression when we've talked about other things. If you're a person that has a strong need to be right, though, it will be very easy to default and make that person be coming from a bad place. Whereas they could have something going on where they're staring ahead and you're thinking, how are you not seeing me trying to merge? And really, they're so engrossed in whatever's going on with them that they don't notice. I mean, I've certainly had cases. I don't know. I'm very sensitive on the road because of all the traffic. So I don't know that I've done that anytime recently, but I can definitely off the top of my head think of times where I might have looked like I was not engaged or not acknowledged someone because I was so in my own mind that I didn't notice that they were waiting to speak to me, or that I was coming across as rude. I could certainly imagine doing that. So I think it's interesting because, again, we're inferring, and we believe that those skills serve us sometimes. We do want to sense danger. We do want to see that we're really connecting with someone, that we want to read their expression and do our best to interpret what that is and then validate where we can. But we can do that and be a jerk too, is part of what I'm thinking. And I don't want to be a jerk.
Yeah. You just said a moment ago, some people have a overriding need to be right. So one of the things I talk about in some of my work is the difference between imposter syndrome, which is this enduring belief that, you are not adequate, that you are, falling short, and that if people find out, it's going to be a problem. And any success that you've had is attributed to luck or being in the right place at the right time. As concerning as imposter syndrome is, there's something that I call epic syndrome. And epic syndrome is this enduring belief that you are right, that the way you see the world is correct, and that if everybody else would just fall in line, that would be great. Thanks very much. And, both ends of that scale are unhealthy. There's a place in the middle where we accept that we are confident, that we know things, that we understand the world a certain way, that other people understand the world differently to us, that they're entitled to see the world differently to us, and that I'm entitled to see the world the way I want to. And there's nothing wrong about them. There's nothing wrong about me. And, that seems like a basis for getting along. And, a very interesting aspect of emotional intelligence is the concept of flexibility. So the ability or willingness to change our mind, see things from a different perspective. And, I always say to people, everybody believes they're flexible when they don't care. So do you want to go see, do you want to go and see a rom-com, or do you want to go and see a sci-fi? I don't care. I like both. Okay, let's talk about politics or religion. Our degree of flexibility changes so drastically when we have an emotional investment in the topic that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're what I call a big need to be right person, maybe that is a reflection on flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
More things are big issues than they are to others, right? More things rise to the level of politics and religion than for others. I find the risk to being that way when I sense I'm feeling that way, I'm making a small issue a bigger issue, is that it affects the way not only that I see the other person, and but then also that is going to have this sort of spill down effect on me. So part of why I believe everyone who cuts me off on the road is having a medical emergency is not because it's really true, but because I want to arrive at a place in a positive emotional state. I'm going to a sales call. I'm going to a business lunch. I'm going to speak somewhere. We know that if you walk into those situations in high arousal, you will then interpret everything else that's coming at you in a different way, right? So I want to be calm and cheerful and ready. And so I'm doing everything I can to regulate myself, even telling myself something that's not true.
Yeah. Absolutely, and the one of the things about what you just about the idea about letting it go is that, and all of this stuff really is that it's a lot of work. And when I work with people, they say, "Well, it seems like a lot of work." So the alternative is just to not think about it and just keep going as you are normal. So there is work involved in doing it.
So great. So Drew, I know we need to wrap up. I'm going to ask you one more question and then give you a chance to talk about your where people find you and talk about your book, which I loved and read twice. My last question is, as the owner seller, you have your own business, right? The EQ Development Group. We talked about that in the bio at the beginning. As the owner / seller, where has knowing all the things you know about emotional intelligence, how has that served you that can help our listeners?
Yeah, our business is relationship based. Most of our work comes from referrals, connections. Understanding emotional intelligence as a principle, I feel, lets you be much more empathetic towards clients. So when a client turns around and says to me, I'd love to do that, but I can't do it till next year, I don't think to myself, yeah, but it'd be great if it'd be in our numbers for this year, though. So let me keep pushing you on that. I totally get it. I understand that situation. So I think there's a really strong empathy element that comes in there. There's certainly pieces around the emotional courage, the picking up the phone piece, working with you. I've been doing some sales outreach recently. And that's been, I feel the emotional courage piece building a part of that. And certainly other aspects of emotional intelligence like assertiveness, independence, I think are really important. But I mean, overall, I think it just makes you look at the world through a clearer lens. I want to be really overt about something. It doesn't help you see the world clearly. We are all looking through a dirty window at the world. It's all colored by our experiences and what we believe and, how we see things, our backgrounds and upbringing. But I believe that developing emotional intelligence lets you see the world more clearly. And I think with that clarity comes the ability to connect more directly with clients, to be more realistic about what is and is not possible, and to build better relationships. And, we often use the term emotional and social intelligence, and building better relationships is really key, not just in the business part of things, but also in life. And I'll leave you with one final thought, which is that there is not one person in your life that does not want you to be more emotionally intelligent. And, whether it's a partner, brother, sister, spouse, doesn't make any difference, parent, friend. If you go to that person and say, hey, listen, if I was more empathetic, if I took more time to understand you, if I managed my emotional reactions better, if I had a clearer understanding of where I need to do work and my relative strengths, and I was better at handling stress and making decisions, is that something that would be good for you? I don't think anybody in the world is going to turn around and say, no, I don't want more of that. I want more of whatever the opposite is. So, and I think that's just as applicable in business and in business development as it is in personal life.
You know, what you're bringing up here is reminding me of my friend Marsh. He has a podcast called The Sales Life, and he uses everything about what he's learned about selling to talk about his philosophy
Yeah.
and personal development in other areas. He does a great job of it. And I'll put it in the show notes so people can follow that one too. But what you're mentioning to me is that whatever my motive is to get better, right? I'm having conflict with my partner. I am scared to sell, and I want to have more emotional courage, and some things that Drew and Catherine have said have made me want to do that. Whatever it is, you have this beautiful spillover effect that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So again, one of the reasons I'm so crazy about talking about beliefs is because as soon as I train myself to notice what I might be believing is true in a sales situation that I come to realize is not necessarily true, that can happen and serve me in all these other realms of my life too, where I think, well, I was inferring something that wasn't there, or I'm attributing an emotion or misjudging something, and I have all this set of assumptions. This spillover to lead to wherever we start. We can start with a personal motive that can affect us positively professionally, or we can start on a professional development and it affects us personally. That back and forth is so glorious to me. I think it's so great, because the reason I love teaching people to sell better is because sales is a skill that is in the value chain of everything you want with your business and your life. What I want really is for people to have the biggest, most wonderful, beautiful lives they can have. It happens that if you're the owner seller, part of how you're going to get there is by selling a lot of product or service, because it creates choices for you. And so it's in the system. The tools of learning to do it are in a system of something greater. And I think the same is true of growing your emotional intelligence. It's going to benefit everything and make everything get better with that practice. And that's why I love that we can have a growth mindset about that, and that a person can get better with practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And the work is never done. I always say anybody that tells you they're really emotionally intelligent probably isn't, because nobody with a good level of emotional intelligence would ever make a statement like that. So we all have work to do, and it's an ongoing process for sure.
But I do think it's an iterative cycle that goes up, right? The circle goes around, but it goes up.
Awareness,
right?
Inspiration. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's really cool. Thank you. Okay. Now you have a resource which came out a while ago, but is still a great resource because it was new to me. So I read it twice. Talk about the Leader's Guide that you created, and also where people can find you.
Sure. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah. So the Leader's Guide to Emotional Intelligence, I published it in 2016. I'm currently working on the second edition right now. It's a book that situates emotional intelligence in the realm of leadership and leadership development, which is an area that I, at the team here at the EQ Development Group, it's what we do a lot of, is working with leadership groups and organizations, as well as individual leaders, to develop. And it gives leaders not only a way of understanding emotional intelligence, it gives them a way of talking about emotional intelligence, understanding their own emotional intelligence. And it also takes one step, which was absent from other resources that are available, which is that it really gives you a very simple way to understand and develop your emotional intelligence.
Yes.
It's got a concrete action planning process. It provides suggestions about how to grow your EQ. And it's designed as sort of a handbook or a guide.
And this is why I want to recommend it to the audience, is exactly the last part that you gave. You list questions. You have scenarios that a person might go through. They might or might not perfectly match those. I read them, and even though I only have 3 people that work in my company with me right now, I could just easily transfer it to other scenarios I've been in, or think about situations in my personal life. But the questions are self-coaching questions. Mm-hmm. And so anyone that's a fan of coaching, anyone that's a fan of personal development, can take the lessons that are inside the chapters and practice. Talk with people that are important to you in your life about them, run through it. And there literally are exercises and self-analysis kinds of things. And that's why I read it twice, is because I thought it was so much more interesting than something that is simply an academic publication about the subscales of emotional intelligence and what we measure and things like that. Although I love geeking out on that too. This is really, you can use the book to self-coach and or share with your team. And I love things like that give me the questions I should be asking so that I can have emotional courage and step into certain situations. I thought that was great.
Fantastic. I appreciate that. Yeah. I'm very proud of it, and I'm excited to work on the new version, which should be out probably early next year. It's hard to make commitments around book deadlines, but let's say early 2023.
Oh, great. Okay, well, great. Well, I'll look for that. Okay, so website-wise, if somebody wants to take the EQI, if they want to know if they should want to take the EQI or any of the above, where do they find you?
Twitter is @Drew_Bird. LinkedIn, a search on Drew Bird Emotional Intelligence will yield the results, or you can drop me a line directly. And the email address is Drew, DREW, @EQDevGroup.com, EQDEVGROUP.com. And that's the same website as well, www.eqdevgroup.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Drew. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time. Great chat.
Appreciate the work you do and for you to give away this information to the audience today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks, Katrin.
I'm so glad you joined us today. If you would like me to come and speak with your organization about how to sell like a good human, please contact me through the website howgoodhumanssell.com. Thanks, and talk with you again.